The Knights Templar, a famous medieval military order, have long been the subject of legend and theories. One of the most persistent claims is that the Templars secretly worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, a charge first levied against them during their 14th century trials. The term Baphomet first appeared decades before the Templars' trials during the Crusades. In a 1098 letter, a crusader described the Muslim Turks at the siege of Antioch, calling upon Baphomet, which most scholars interpret as a corruption of Muhammad. Medieval European crusaders generally mischaracterized Islam as idolatry. They believed Muslims worshipped Muhammad as their god. By the late 13th and early 14th century, Baphomet had thus entered the Christian lexicon as a term connoting a pagan or false idol. Against this backdrop, the Knights Templar fell under suspicion. On October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars in France, motivated largely by his debts to the wealthy order and a desire to seize their assets. Philip, with the cooperation of Pope Clement V's inquisitors, accused the Templars of numerous heresies. Over 100 charges were leveled against the order, including denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, illicit practices, and worshipping an idol named Baphomet. Notably, many of these accusations mirrored those earlier aimed at other enemies of the Church, such as the Cathars, suggesting a template of charges rather than unique misdeeds. Under the pressure of torture and imprisonment by the medieval Inquisition, some Templars confessed to these charges. The idol of Baphomet featured in several such confessions, though descriptions of it varied wildly. According to the trial records, different Templars gave contradictory accounts. Some described a head, others an idol with 3 faces, and others spoke of a human skull or a cat figure as the object of veneration. It's important to note that no physical idol or tangible evidence of Baphomet was ever produced. The name Baphomet itself didn't even appear in the initial arrest warrants or the formal papal charges. Those documents only generically accused the Templars of adoration of idols. The specific name emerged from the interrogations, suggesting it was driven by the questions or expectations of the inquisitors. Of 231 knights interrogated in Paris, only 12, barely 5%, confessed, under torture, to knowing anything about Baphomet. Notably, far greater numbers confessed to other charges, such as more routine claims of blasphemy. This disparity indicates that even under extreme duress, the Baphomet charge was not widely substantiated compared to more mundane forced confessions. However, the inquisitors didn't take this to mean that Baphomet didn't exist as an object of worship, but rather that the Templars held Baphomet so dear they wouldn't name the idol. During the trials, many Templars withdrew or recanted their confessions when not facing torture, and contemporaries were often skeptical of the more outlandish accusations. Even Pope Clement V initially doubted Philip's allegations. Outside France, papal investigations in other regions such as England, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire found little evidence of heresy. Many Templars in those regions were eventually exonerated or given light penances. In France, however, Philip's political pressure prevailed. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, after years of imprisonment, dramatically retracted his forced confession and declared the order's innocence. For his audacity, he was put to the torch in 1314. Modern historians widely agree that the Templars' supposed worship of Baphomet was a false charge lacking any genuine proof. The overwhelming consensus was that the confessions were both coerced and unreliable, and relied upon typical methods associated with the Inquisition. Notably, many contemporaries didn't believe the Baphomet confessions to be legitimate. However, they did suspect that many Templars had become crypto-Muslims. Modern historians generally dismiss the idea that the Templars would suddenly, en masse, adopt the doctrines of their mortal enemies. That said, there were cases of individual Templars converting to Islam. Robert of St. Albans, an English Templar, became Muslim and joined up with Saladin in the 1180s. For this action, he was granted the right to marry one of Saladin's relatives. These acts shocked Christendom and may have led to the idea that Templars harbored secret sympathy for their enemies. Importantly, no credible evidence has ever emerged that the Templars venerated anything called Baphomet. Although the Templars were dissolved, then subsequently exonerated by the Church in later years, the lurid idea of their occult practices didn't vanish. After centuries of obscurity, the Baphomet legend was revived in the 19th century amid a resurgence of interest in the Templars, Freemasonry, and the occult. Enlightenment and Romantic era writers began speculating about what hidden wisdom the Templars might have possessed. In 1818, Austrian Orientalist Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall published an essay that claimed to find Templar Baphomet idols and linked the order to Gnostic sects. Famously, a major turning point came with French occultist Eliphas Levi. In the mid-19th century, he famously illustrated Baphomet as the Sabbatic goat, a winged, goat-headed androgynous figure laden with esoteric symbolism. Levi took the name Baphomet, which he believed the Templars had used, and transformed it into a symbol of cosmic balance in his occult philosophy. Since this time, Levi's goat-like depiction of Baphomet has become the best-known image of this entity. That said, it's important to remember that the Sabbatic goat was never historically associated with the Templars, nor was it based on contemporary Inquisition accusations. The idea that the Templars worshipped a demon named Baphomet is in essence a myth, but it's a myth that still has a ton of cultural weight almost a millennium later. The Honjo Masamune is often regarded as the ultimate samurai sword, a legendary blade forged by the master swordsmith Masamune in medieval Japan. For centuries it was treasured as a symbol of authority, representing the power of the Tokugawa regime during the Edo period. The sword was so esteemed that it was designated a national treasure of Japan in 1939. However, despite its celebrated status, the Honjo Masamune vanished in the aftermath of World War II, leaving behind a mystery that endures to this day. The story of the Honjo Masamune begins with its creator, Goro Masamune, who lived in the late 13th to early 14th century. Masamune is revered as Japan's greatest swordsmith, known for developing revolutionary forging techniques that produced blades of unparalleled quality. The Honjo Masamune itself gained its name and fame in the Sengoku, or Warring States period. In 1561, a samurai general named Honjo Shiganaga acquired the sword during a fierce battle. As the story goes, Shiganaga was attacked by an enemy wielding this Masamune blade. The sword struck Shiganaga's helmet and split it, though he somehow survived the blow unharmed. Shiganaga defeated his attacker and claimed the sword as one of the spoils of war, and thereafter the blade came to be known by his name, Honjo Masamune. Honjo Shiganaga eventually sold the prize sword to the Toyotomi clan. The Honjo Masamune passed through the hands of powerful figures in Japan. It was first owned by Toyotomi Hidetsugu, the nephew of the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi eventually came to possess it himself, and from there it came into the possession of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu founded the Tokugawa shogunate, and after he became shogun in 1603, the sword became a part of the Tokugawa family's treasures. For over 2.5 centuries of the Edo period, the sword was a ceremonial blade symbolizing the shogun's authority, handed down through generations of Tokugawa rulers. The tumult of World War II set the stage for the Honjo Masamune's disappearance. In 1945, Japan's surrender brought an Allied occupation government that mandated the disarmament of the population. All Japanese citizens, including former samurai aristocracy, were ordered to surrender all weapons, which also included priceless antique swords. The Honjo Masamune held by the Tokugawa family was not spared. In December 1945, its custodian Tokugawa Ieyasu complied with the order. He turned over the Honjo Masamune, along with several other priceless family swords, to the Majiro police station in Tokyo. The understanding was that these swords were to be kept safe and may eventually be returned to the family during the process of rebuilding Japan. In January 1946, the surrendered swords were handed over by the police to a U.S. officer from the Foreign Liquidation Commission. But there was just one problem. He identified himself by the traditional all-American name, Coldy Bymore. Now, unsurprisingly to any native English speaker, Coldy Bymore wasn't a name that corresponded to any real American serviceman. After that transfer, the trail went cold. The sword never appeared in any official records or collections again, effectively vanishing from history. The fate of the weapon has been the subject of much speculation. Over the decades, historians, sword enthusiasts, and treasure hunters have proposed several theories about what became of this legendary blade. One possibility is that the legendary weapon was inadvertently destroyed along with many other surrendered swords. During the occupation, many confiscated swords were dumped at sea or melted down. It's conceivable the Honjo Masamune was unknowingly destroyed along with those piles of blades. Under this theory, the American handlers failed to realize its significance, believing it was a mass-produced sword from the war. Personally, I have some doubts about this given the appearance of the Masamune swords, which are clearly of extremely high quality even to a non-expert. Another theory is that Coldy Bymore, whoever he actually was, realized the value of the Honjo Masamune and kept it as a personal war trophy. American servicemen were generally permitted to take swords home as war trophies. It's very plausible that the Honjo Masamune was kept by the officer who took it. If so, it may have been quietly passed down in that person's family, or otherwise changed hands in private after the war. That is to say, you could have Grandpa Coldy's Honjo Masamune hanging above your fireplace. Another theory is that Coldy Bymore was made up by someone in the Japanese police who knew the value of the sword. Under this theory, this individual knew that a Tokugawa descendant dropped off rare and valuable swords and fabricated a story about an American serviceman coming to grab it. Unfamiliar with American naming conventions, this individual thought up the absurd name Coldy Bymore and kept the sword for himself. Other theories consider that it may be held in a private collection, and the reason why it hasn't been returned is that it was purchased on the black market. Occasional claims and rumors have popped up. For example, excitement brewed in 2013 when a long-lost Masamune sword turned up at the Kyoto National Museum. However, it turned out to be a different blade, the Shimazu Masamune, which hadn't had a verified sighting since 1862. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're always notified whenever I drop new content. In August 1942, a routine U.S. Navy patrol over the Pacific Ocean turned into a baffling mystery that remains unsolved to this day. During World War II, the U.S. Navy made use of blimps to patrol the coasts and guard against enemy submarines. In the early months of the war, Japanese submarines had prowled the west coast, sinking several ships and even shelling targets in California and Oregon. In response, the Navy bolstered its coastal defenses by deploying blimps for surveillance. The L-8 was one of a series of small L-class non-rigid airships originally built by Goodyear for advertising, which the Navy acquired to help patrol American shores. Though modest in size and crew, usually just 2 men, these blimps proved useful for spotting signs of enemy submarines and could even attack with small depth bombs. The L-8 blimp itself had an interesting history leading up to the incident. It took part in a notable mission in April 1942, delivering vital parts to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in the Pacific, as that ship headed out to launch the Doolittle raid. By the summer of 1942, Blimp L-8 was based at Treasure Island near San Francisco and assigned routine anti-submarine patrols along the California coast. Its 2-man crew on August 16, 1942, consisted of Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adams, both U.S. Navy aviators with experience in airship operations. On the morning of August 16, 1942, L-8 lifted off from Treasure Island at around 6 a.m. for a patrol over the Pacific waters just outside San Francisco Bay. Conditions were calm and slightly overcast, and visibility was good for several miles. The blimp's mission was to scour the ocean surface for any sign of enemy submarines within a 50-mile radius. After about an hour and a half of flight, as L-8 passed over the Golden Gate and headed toward the Farallon Islands, the crew radioed in a routine position report. At 7:42 a.m., Lieutenant Cody sent a message, quote, "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." This was a significant report since oil on the water could indicate a submarine lurking below. It was the last communication ever received from the blimp. When L-8 failed to check in as scheduled, the Navy grew concerned. Repeated calls to the blimp went unanswered. By 8:20 a.m., the airship's radio silence had been noticed, and by 8:50 a.m., the Navy dispatched 2 aircraft to search for the missing blimp. At around 10:50 a.m., a Pan American Airways pilot reported spotting an L-class blimp floating over the Golden Gate Bridge, apparently under control and heading back toward base. Minutes later, another search plane saw the blimp near the coast, rising through the low clouds at about 2,000 feet. It became clear this was L-8. However, the blimp's movements soon grew erratic. Around 11:15 a.m., to the surprise of onlookers, L-8 suddenly descended out of the clouds and came down near Ocean Beach, just south of San Francisco. 2 Army coastal defense soldiers and local fishermen who saw the blimp dropping rushed to grab its guide ropes as the 150-foot airship brushed the beach sand. The gondola door was found hanging open, and inside everything appeared normal, except that the 2 crewmen were missing. Before the astonished would-be rescuers could secure the blimp, it lightened and gently rose back up into the air. L-8 drifted inland, cleared a coastal cliff, and slowly floated over the city. About 15 minutes later, the empty blimp deflated and settled gently down onto a street in Daly City, a suburb just outside San Francisco. Navy personnel and local authorities immediately swarmed the scene of L-8's very soft crash landing. They found the airship largely undamaged. The blimp's engines were idle, there was fuel in the tanks, and the radio was in working order. The cabin door had been latched open, suggesting it was intentionally propped that way during flight. Inside the gondola, all the required safety equipment was present and properly stowed, including a rubber life raft and 2 parachutes, but 2 inflatable life vests were missing. Those life vests were standard gear that Cody and Adams would have been wearing while flying over water. Aside from the crew, nothing else had vanished from the blimp. There was no sign of fire, struggle, or malfunction. Investigators even checked the blimp's bilge, the bottom compartment, and found a layer of dust, confirming that L-8 had never touched down on the ocean. In other words, it hadn't crashed or landed in the water at any point, causing the men to bail out. The 2 men had simply gone missing in midair. The Navy launched an extensive search along the coast, but no trace of Lieutenant Cody or Ensign Adams was ever found. The disappearance of L-8's crew left everyone grasping for answers. The official Navy investigation ultimately concluded that the most likely cause was a tragic accident during the patrol. The Navy surmised that one of the men might have opened the cabin door to investigate the oil slick, leaned out too far, and fallen from the blimp at low altitude. The second man, realizing his crewmate was in trouble, could have hurried to the open door and also been pulled out or lost his balance in an attempt to save him. This scenario would explain why the door was latched open and why both life vests were gone. With the sudden loss of two people, the blimp would have quickly become lighter and risen out of control, which is consistent with its observed behavior throughout the morning. The Navy considered this the most plausible explanation and labeled the incident an involuntary abandonment of the airship. Even so, officials acknowledged two nagging points that kept the case mysterious. No one on the sea's surface reported seeing the men fall, and much more curiously, no bodies or any other evidence was ever recovered. Over the years, many other theories have been floated to explain what might have happened to Cody and Adams in those fateful moments. Some proposed an enemy action, for example, that a Japanese submarine surfaced and somehow abducted the crew. Others pointed to possible foul play or human drama, with rumors ranging from a secret stowaway hiding on board who overpowered the men, to one crewman slaying the other. This last theory, which is pure speculation, points to the possibility of a personal dispute, which dramatically led to the dying man pulling the perpetrator out of the blimp. While this definitely has a Hollywood quality to it, I have to stress that this narrative is essentially straight-up fiction, with the only piece of evidence being that both men went missing. More outlandish theories have also been suggested, including rogue waves and alien abductions, but again, there's simply no evidence to suggest these events actually occurred. Personally, I think the Navy's investigation here likely got it right, at least on a balance of probabilities. And yes, that is to say that we will never know for sure what happened to these men, but we can have a fairly good idea. Götz von Berlichingen was a German imperial knight in the Holy Roman Empire, famed for his iron prosthetic hand and his daring exploits in battle. Born into a noble but modest Franconian family in modern-day Baden-Württemberg, he grew up in an era of constant local wars and feuds. As a young man, he entered the service of high-ranking nobles. By 1497, he was serving Margrave Frederick of Brandenburg-Ansbach, and a year later he fought in campaigns under Emperor Maximilian I. By 1500, Götz had left formal service to form his own band of mercenaries, hiring out his sword to various dukes and barons. This independent streak and martial skill quickly earned him renown and a rise to prominence among the warrior nobility of southern Germany. Throughout his 47-year career, Götz von Berlichingen was involved in numerous conflicts and private feuds that were common in the fractious Holy Roman Empire. He claimed to have fought in at least 15 feuds under his own name, often leading a personal troop of armed followers. These feuds pitted him against powerful cities and lords. For example, in 1512 he waylaid a caravan of wealthy merchants from Nuremberg, an act that provoked Emperor Maximilian to make Götz an outlaw until he paid a heavy fine. A few years later, in 1516, Götz quarreled with the Archbishop of Mainz. During that feud, he captured a nobleman and held him for ransom, which again led to him being declared an outlaw again, this time until 1518. Götz didn't shy away from larger-scale conflicts either. In 1519, he joined Duke Ulrich of Württemberg in war against the Swabian League, a powerful alliance of imperial cities and princes. Götz commanded the defense of the fortress of Mockmühl, but was eventually forced to surrender due to lack of supplies. Despite being promised safe conduct, he was arrested and handed over to his enemies. He secured release in 1522, only after paying ransom and swearing an oath not to seek revenge. In 1525, during the German Peasants' War, the rebel peasants in the Odenwald region pressed Götz to be their commander. He reluctantly accepted leadership of the peasant army, hoping to restrain their excesses, but found them beyond control. After about a month, he abandoned the rebels and returned to his castle, declaring he never truly supported their cause. That said, his brief and open support of the peasants, along with his conflicts with the wealthy and powerful, led him to be held in high esteem amongst the peasantry. Following the suppression of the revolt, Götz was called to account at the Diet of Speyer. He was acquitted in 1526, but the Swabian League later lured him to Augsburg under false pretenses and imprisoned him from 1528 to 1530 as retaliation for past grievances. In 1540, Emperor Charles V finally enlisted the aging knight in imperial service. Götz campaigned against the Ottoman Turks in Hungary in 1542 and fought in the emperor's invasion of France in 1544. Only after these campaigns did he retire to his family castle for a more peaceful life at the ripe age of 64. Throughout these conflicts, Götz cultivated a reputation as a fearless, though often lawless knight who stood up to powerful authorities. He was known to rob or ransom the rich while often sparing or even aiding ordinary peasants, which earned him a folk hero status as a kind of German Robin Hood in popular legend. One of the most defining episodes in Götz von Berlichingen's life occurred in 1504 during the War of the Succession of Landshut. While fighting at the siege of Landshut in Bavaria, the 23-year-old knight was struck by an enemy cannonball, severing Götz's right arm at the wrist. Losing a sword hand in the early 16th century generally ended a warrior's career, if not his life. For Götz, however, this injury was a setback he refused to let define him. Remarkably, he recovered from the wound and almost immediately sought a way to continue fighting. He commissioned an iron prosthetic hand to replace the lost one, allowing him to return to the battlefield despite his disability. The loss of his natural hand did little to slow Götz's martial pursuits, and he retrained himself to wield a sword with his left hand. This resilience in the face of such an injury added to his renown and the dread he inflicted upon opponents. In his later years, Götz would even boast that his artificial hand, quote, rendered more service in the fight than ever did the original flesh. Götz's iron hand was an extraordinary feat of engineering for the early 1500s. In fact, he had two prosthetic iron hands made over time. The first iron hand, crafted soon after his 1504 injury by a local blacksmith, was a relatively simple device. It featured 4 movable fingers shaped like hooks, with 2 hinges at the knuckles, so that Götz could bend them inward to grip a shield. Importantly, while some modern sources imply that he gripped his sword with this iron fist, this was never the case. After some years of continued combat using the first prosthetic, Götz upgraded to a more advanced model. His second iron hand, made sometime in the 1520s, was a marvel of Renaissance metalwork. This version extended further up his forearm and was secured with leather straps for stability. Unlike the first prosthetic, the second hand had articulated joints for each finger and thumb, allowing a much greater range of grip positions. Götz could use his good left hand to bend and position the metal fingers of the prosthetic into a desired grip, and an internal mechanism would lock the fingers in place. The combination of hinges, ratchets, and springs meant Götz's iron hand could achieve both cosmetic and functional purposes. It looked roughly like a gauntleted hand and could perform practical tasks of grasping or holding objects. The successful construction of such a sophisticated prosthetic limb in the early 16th century was made possible by the era's advances in metalworking and mechanical engineering. Master armorers and locksmiths of the early modern period were highly skilled. They could forge articulated armor, craft weapons with trigger mechanisms, and build early clocks with gears and springs. Guts's iron hand applied these same principles on a smaller scale, effectively making him one of the first recorded users of a functional biomechanical prosthesis. Had he been born just a couple decades earlier, this legendary knight would have never been. Today, both of Guts von Berlichingen's iron hands survive and are on display at his family castle in Jagdshausen, Germany. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're always notified whenever I drop new content. Also, if you didn't know, I also have my main channel, Lazy Chill Zone, which has hundreds of hours of content on mysteries, crime, and more. Beneath the waters of the Sea of Galilee lies a colossal structure that has mystified scientists since its discovery. This underwater anomaly is massive, ancient, and purposefully built, raising more questions than answers about the region's distant past. The Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake in northern Israel, through which the Jordan River flows. In the summer of 2003, a routine sonar survey of the lake's southwestern floor detected something wholly unexpected, a massive circular anomaly on the otherwise smooth basin. Subsequent dives confirmed the presence of an enormous pile of stones, arranged in a cone-shaped formation, rising about 30 feet from the lake bed. Measuring roughly 200 feet in diameter, about twice the width of Stonehenge's outer stone circle, and weighing an estimated 60,000 tons, the structure dwarfs most modern-day warships in mass. Its sheer size and hidden location immediately captured researchers' attention, and archaeologists were left puzzled as to its purpose and age. Divers who inspected the site found it to be composed of unhewn basalt boulders up to 3 feet long, piled atop one another with no obvious pattern or chisel marks. In essence, it's a giant rock cairn, a heap of stones lacking discernible walls or corners, yet clearly man-made in origin. Notably, the basalt rock is foreign to the immediate lake vicinity. While basalt is common in the surrounding Golan Heights, it doesn't naturally lie in the Sea of Galilee's basin. This indicates the stones were deliberately hauled to the site from over a mile away. The structure's builders, whoever they were, undertook a monumental task of transporting and piling these heavy rocks underwater, or on land that later became submerged. From the outset, researchers have virtually unanimously agreed on a human origin for this structure. So the big question has been, when was it built, and why? These questions have proven difficult to answer. Based on the accumulation of sediment around its base, scientists estimate that the stone pile has sat underwater for several millennia. One analysis of sediment buildup suggests the structure could have been constructed anywhere from 2,000 to 12,000 years ago, a broad range that indicates significant uncertainty. Many archaeologists have tentatively dated it to the early Bronze Age, approximately 3000 to 2000 BC. This is largely due to its proximity to well-known Bronze Age settlements and the presence of similar megalithic monuments in the region. For example, the large fortified city of Bet Yera thrived about a mile from the site. Further, a 5,000-year-old stone circle complex found nearby this city attests to a local tradition of massive stone constructions. The effort required to build the submerged cairn, hauling tens of thousands of tons of rock and piling them high, implies a complex, well-organized society with advanced planning skills. Researchers have proposed several ideas about what this enigmatic structure might have been used for. Many cairns around the world serve as markers for burials or tombs. The Galilee structure's resemblance to ancient burial mounds in Europe hints that it might have been a massive tomb or memorial for the dead. Indeed, similar stone heaps are often used to mark burials, though researchers have not yet confirmed if this was the case here. Another theory suggests it could have been a ritual site used by the nearby settlement. Its proximity to the early Bronze Age city of Bet Yara suggests it might have held ceremonial significance or served as a public monument associated with that town. Without artifacts, its exact role is unclear, but it may have been a gathering place or a foundation for some long-lost structure important to the local society. However, this theory assumes that the anomaly was above water at the time, which itself hasn't been proven yet. Perhaps the most interesting theory is that the cairn was used as an early form of aquaculture. Piles of stones can create sheltered habitats for fish breeding, and such stone fish nurseries were known in the Sea of Galilee region in antiquity. This theory posits that the structure could have been an ancient fisherman's installation to enhance fish stocks. However, if this is the case, this structure is much larger than other similar structures found in the region. Despite these intriguing theories, the true nature of the Sea of Galilee anomaly remains unresolved. To date, no artifacts have been recovered from the site to conclusively determine its age or the identity of its builders. Archaeologists emphasize that only a dedicated underwater excavation will yield definitive answers, yet such an endeavor is both logistically challenging and costly. The structure lies under 30 feet of water, where visibility is extremely low, and any disturbance kicks up clouds of silt, complicating excavation efforts. Furthermore, a full-scale dig would require significant funding and specialized equipment, a fact which experts believe to be unlikely. Despite the Sea of Galilee likely containing significant historically valuable artifacts, no underwater archaeological digs have ever taken place there. Henry Hudson's disappearance in the early 17th century remains one of history's most intriguing maritime mysteries. Hudson was a renowned English navigator who ventured into uncharted waters during the Age of Exploration. He made significant discoveries in North America, yet his final voyage ended in mutiny and an uncertain fate. Before his ill-fated final voyage, Henry Hudson had already made 3 notable expeditions. In 1607 and 1608, sailing for English merchants, he attempted to find a northeast passage to Asia across the Arctic, but each time his path was blocked by impenetrable ice. In 1609, now backed by the Dutch East India Company, Hudson turned westward in search of a northwest passage. He crossed the Atlantic and explored the North American coast, venturing into present-day Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay. He then sailed up a great river in what would later be New York. That river would later be named the Hudson River in his honor. Although he never did find a new route to Asia, Hudson became the first European to map the Hudson River, and he claimed the surrounding territory for the Netherlands. This achievement cemented his reputation as an accomplished explorer. News of Hudson's discoveries soon made him a figure of keen interest in England. Determined not to lose such a talented explorer to a rival nation, English investors quickly arranged a new expedition for Hudson under their flag. In 1610, with the backing of the Virginia Company and the British East India Company, Henry Hudson set sail once more, a voyage that would tragically be his last. Hudson's final expedition departed England in April 1610 aboard the ship Discovery. He led a crew of about 24 men, including his teenage son John. Their goal was to locate a westward route to Asia through the Arctic waters of North America. By midsummer 1610, Hudson navigated Discovery through the icy channel, now known as Hudson Strait, at the northern tip of Labrador, and entered a vast inland sea. This was Hudson's first view of what would later be called Hudson Bay. And yeah, if you haven't gathered it by now, this guy was kind of a big deal in terms of exploration. Believing this enormous bay might be the long-sought Pacific Passage, Hudson eagerly charted its coastline for months. As autumn set in without any sign of an outlet to the Pacific, the realization dawned that the bay was landlocked. In November, the Discovery became trapped by thick ice in the far south of Hudson Bay, near James Bay. Hudson and his crew were forced to winter in the unforgiving wilderness. The crew's situation over the winter of 1610 to 1611 was dire. They hauled the ship ashore and hunkered down on the desolate coast to wait for spring. Freezing temperatures, dwindling food supplies, and outbreaks of scurvy tormented the men. Morale plummeted as the starving crew grew increasingly resentful, blaming Hudson's relentless quest for a passage for their misery. By the time the ice began to thaw in June 1611, many of the men were weak, desperate, and ready to return home at any cost. Hudson, however, was not ready to abandon his mission and apparently had little to no ability to read the room, or read the deck as the situation may have been. Even after the horrible winter, he wanted to continue exploring westward once the bay cleared of ice. Most of his crew vehemently disagreed. They demanded to sail back to England immediately. This clash set the stage for a mutiny. On June 22, 1611, as the Discovery prepared to get underway, the disgruntled crew seized their chance to rebel. The mutineers took control of the ship and overpowered those still loyal to the captain. In the aftermath of the mutiny, the mutineers cast Henry Hudson, his son John, and a handful of loyal crew adrift in a small open boat. The rebels supplied the castaways with only minimal provisions and then cut the rope, leaving them behind in the middle of Hudson Bay. And yes, it feels odd to say they left Henry Hudson in the middle of Hudson Bay, but it is what it is. Hudson and the 8 others with him in that tiny boat were never seen again. As Hudson's abandoned boat faded from view, the Discovery, now under the mutineers' command, set sail for England. The Discovery reached England later that year, with only 8 crewmen remaining. The survivors were arrested and put on trial for the slaying of Henry Hudson, but in the end, none were punished due to lack of proof and conflicting testimonies. To put it simply, the seamen were all over the place, and no one wanted to deal with cleaning up that mess. The mutineers claimed they had simply marooned their captain, not snuffed him out. With Hudson himself missing and unable to tell his side of the story, the true events of the mutiny remained murky. What ultimately happened to Henry Hudson and the men set adrift with him remained an open question that would haunt history. The mystery of Henry Hudson's disappearance has spawned numerous theories about what happened after he was cast adrift. Because no definitive evidence of Hudson or his crew was ever found, historians and adventurers have hypothesized several possible fates. One theory suggests Hudson was never actually set adrift at all, but rather he was slain by the mutineers during the takeover. Some very suspicious evidence was noted when the Discovery returned. For instance, there were bloodstains on the deck that no one seemed to have an explanation for. And I really have to question why these seamen couldn't think up a plausible excuse for the stains during their months-long voyage back to the homeland. After all, the forensic technology at the time was, well, let's just call it limited. It's possible the mutineers concocted the story of setting Hudson loose to hide the true story. However, without bodies or eyewitnesses beyond the mutineers themselves, this theory remains speculative. Other theories propose that Hudson and his companions survived for a time after being marooned. Given their proximity to land, they might have reached the shores of James Bay. In fact, years later in 1631, explorer Thomas James reported finding the remains of a crude shelter on an island in James Bay, perhaps built by Hudson's stranded party. Some believe the castaways could have been rescued or captured by indigenous peoples, and there's actually way more evidence for this than you might think. Cree oral traditions speak of a stranded group of white men who were either captured or rescued depending on the telling. However, given the oral nature of these legends, It's unclear what time period this is referring to. French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1613 recorded hearing of an English boy taken in by the Algonquin people after a shipwreck in the far north. Notably, in the 1950s, a stone was found in Deep River in Ontario with the initials HH and the year 1612. Adding more interest to the narrative, the stone also had the words "captive" etched into it. Notably, no one has been able to determine when this carving was actually made. Others suspect that Hudson, his son, and remaining crew simply died of exposure, given that they were left with almost no supplies. Even though this is the least interesting theory of all, it's the one I tend to prefer, since the crew members themselves openly stated they gave them very little in the way of goods to survive on. And this was the crew members' version of events trying to make themselves look at least somewhat good and reasonable under the circumstances. In the summer of 1907, Dublin Castle became the center of a mystery that still fascinates historians. The Irish crown jewels, a set of jeweled regalia belonging to the Order of St. Patrick, vanished from a secure safe within the castle walls. The theft was discovered just days before a planned royal visit, causing a scandal that shook the British administration in Ireland. On the morning of July 6, 1907, a cleaning woman arrived for her routine duties at Bedford Tower in Dublin Castle and found something amiss. The door to the strong room where the jewels safe was kept stood wide open, with a key still dangling in the lock. The inner security door was bolted, so at first nothing seemed obviously stolen. Sir Arthur Vickers, the official custodian of the jewels, was initially unconcerned and went about his day. It was only later that afternoon, when a messenger was sent to store a knight's ceremonial collar in the safe, that the grim truth was revealed. The safe had been emptied and the Irish crown jewels were gone. The alarm spread quickly. The jewels had disappeared just 4 days before King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were due in Dublin for a state visit. A special investiture ceremony was to take place at the Irish International Exhibition, where the king planned to use the jewels to induct a new member of the Order of St. Patrick. With the regalia missing, the ceremony had to be cancelled. King Edward was reportedly furious about the theft, and the incident proved to be a major embarrassment for the Irish authorities. The Dublin Metropolitan Police launched an immediate investigation, and even a detective from London's Scotland Yard, Chief Inspector John Kane, was called in to assist. Investigators found no signs of forced entry on the doors or the safe, indicating that whoever stole the jewels had used the actual keys or precise copies. From the very start, suspicion focused on an inside job. Evidence from the crime scene reinforced the idea that the thief was someone with intimate access and patience. Inside the safe, the perpetrators had shown meticulous care. For example, a sky blue ribbon that had been attached to one of the jeweled badges was carefully unscrewed and left behind in its box. This is a task that would have taken several minutes, and the authorities speculated an outsider would have ripped it off in a hurry. Likewise, the tissue and cloth in the storage boxes were neatly refolded after the jewels were removed. This was no smash-and-grab robbery. It appeared the thief had ample time and no fear of interruption. The careful method of the theft, combined with the lack of forced entry, made it clear the culprit likely had authorized access to keys and inside knowledge of the castle's security routines. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to those who had custody or access to the safe. The foremost figure was Sir Arthur Vickers, Ulster King of Arms, whose prestigious office included the duty of guarding the jeweled insignia. Vickers was responsible for the keys. He usually kept one of the 2 safe keys on his person and stored the other at his home in a locked drawer. In the wake of the theft, Vickers became one of the first suspects, simply due to his role and a series of security lapses on his watch. It emerged that Vickers had been alarmingly lax in safeguarding the jewels, On one occasion, he had drunkenly allowed friends to handle the keys, even waking up after a party to find himself draped in the priceless jewels as a prank. Personally, I speculate that this may have been a dry run for the jewel heist, and also perhaps one of the world's first documented uses of the "it's just a prank, bro" excuse. But this wasn't the only negligent thing Vickers had done. Far from it. Just weeks before the heist, he had mistakenly left the safe's key on a key ring with other office keys, which one of the servants then found and returned. Such stories cast Vickers as a negligent buffoon at best. Vickers, however, vehemently denied any involvement in the theft. He insisted he was being made a scapegoat and maintained his innocence to his dying day. Despite the lack of hard evidence tying him to the crime, Vickers faced severe consequences, and King Edward demanded his resignation. A secretive vice-regal commission later found Vickers guilty of negligence in his duties, but stopped short of finding that he was in on it. This effectively ended his career and tarnished his reputation. Another figure under scrutiny was Pierce Mahoney, an Office of Arms employee who was Vickers's nephew and assistant. Mahoney had access to the Office of Arms and was familiar with the castle's operations. He was questioned as a possible accomplice or culprit. However, most contemporaries and later historians believe Mahoney was innocent. He had no clear motive to steal the jewels and was known to be loyal to Vickers. Suspicion soon concentrated on Francis Shackleton, a charismatic man who was Vickers's second-in-command at Dublin Castle. Francis Shackleton was the younger brother of the famous Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, which gave the case an added dose of public intrigue. Unlike his explorer brother, Francis sought his fortunes in high society circles. And let's just say that Shackleton was known to get around these circles and was particularly interested in becoming very closely acquainted with wealthy and powerful men. Vickers had appointed Shackleton to the honorary position of Dublin Herald in the Office of Arms in 1905, which, while unpaid, gave him status and access to Dublin Castle. Shackleton was often a house guest of Vickers, even sharing Vickers's residence during stays in Dublin. This close relationship meant Shackleton could potentially get hold of Vickers' keys without raising suspicion. Moreover, investigators uncovered that Shackleton was in dire financial straits by 1907. He had been involved in speculative ventures that failed, and his debts were mounting, a strong possible motive for a theft of valuable jewels. All these factors made Francis Shackleton a prime suspect in the eyes of many. Indeed, Vickers himself later accused Shackleton of betrayal, and numerous people at the time believed Shackleton was the true culprit behind the heist. One theory, reported years later, suggested that Shackleton, together with his close friend Captain Richard Gorges, had capitalized on Vickers's lax security. According to this account, one night after Vickers had drunk himself into a stupor, Shackleton and Gorges supposedly lifted the keys from the sleeping Vickers. They entered the library safe, removed the jewels, then returned everything, keys and doors, to normal, so no immediate suspicion would arise. This clever ruse would mean the theft wasn't discovered until weeks later, giving the thieves a long head start. However, despite these suspicions and rumors, Francis Shackleton was never formally charged. In the official investigation, he maintained an alibi. Conveniently, he had left Ireland for London on June 11, 1907, and did not return until after the jewels were reported missing. This alibi didn't entirely clear him for two simple reasons. It's never been entirely clear when the Irish crown jewels were actually stolen, and he may have had an accomplice such as Gorges do the deed. Some have speculated that investigators were reluctant to prosecute Shackleton for fear he might expose scandalous information about others in high society if cornered. Francis Shackleton was known to get around high society circles, and let's just say a lot of influential men may not like what he had to say about their late-night activities. Shackleton's later life did little to dispel doubts about his character. A few years after the Jewel affair, he was convicted of fraud for unrelated financial crimes in 1913 and spent time in prison. He had even fled the UK to Portuguese East Africa for a time, where he attempted to work in the colonial administration and later found work on a plantation. Upon release, he changed his name and lived quietly abroad, dying in obscurity many years later, having never admitted any role in the Dublin Castle heist. A final suspect emerged long after the initial investigation: Francis Bennett Goldney. Goldney was an Englishman who had been appointed to a minor post at Dublin Castle just months before the jewels vanished. At the time of the theft, Goldney attracted little suspicion as he was seen as a wealthy, respectable gentleman with no obvious motive. And yes, you heard me correctly, he wasn't investigated because he was already seen as rich enough, as if being wealthy had ever stopped someone from accumulating more wealth. It was only in 1918, when Goldney died in a car accident in France, that his reputation darkened. After his death, authorities discovered a trove of stolen historical items hidden in his home, revealing that Goldney had been secretly stealing valuable artifacts. This shocking discovery led some to retroactively suspect Goldney in the Irish crown jewels case. If he was willing to steal manuscripts and artworks, perhaps he also stole the jewels. Investigators never found any direct evidence linking Goldney to the 1907 heist, but his later infamy as a thief added another tantalizing theory to the saga. Notably, some have suggested that there was a curse on the Irish crown jewels. Vickers was executed in 1921 during the Irish War of Independence on suspicion that he was a British sympathizer. Francis Shackleton's life spiraled down after 1907. By 1910, he was bankrupt, and in the years that followed, he was convicted for multiple fraudulent schemes, including swindling a longtime friend out of a fortune. Despite being from a wealthy and famous family, he died in relative poverty, living under an assumed name. Captain Richard Gorges, who had been whispered about as Shackleton's accomplice, likewise led a troubled life. He was involved in a violent incident with the police in which he ended up slaying an officer. Due to some complicating circumstances, he was only sentenced to 12 years in prison. While in prison, Gorges allegedly tried to bargain for leniency by offering information about the crown jewels, but authorities did not deem his claims credible. Gorges was later prosecuted for minor offenses, including shoplifting and passing bad checks. In 1944, he was struck by a train in London, ending the tale of Captain Richard Gorges once and for all. Potentially for reasons of propriety and saving face for a wealthy family of the landed gentry, his death seems to have been ruled accidental, but you can apply your own judgment. Pierce Mahoney, Vickers' loyal assistant, withdrew from public life in 1914. He was found dead by an accidental shot in a boating incident, a mysterious end that some have wondered about. As for Francis Bennett Goldney, he continued a respectable public career, even becoming a member of Parliament, until his car accident in 1918. Despite intensive investigations and worldwide attention, the Irish crown jewels have never been recovered. Notably, the jewels weren't inherently incredibly valuable at the time. It was their status as the Irish crown jewels and the historical value of the jewels that made them just so priceless. Modern theorists speculate that for this reason, it's unlikely that the goods were broken up, anonymized, and sold separately. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're always notified whenever I drop new content. Also, if you didn't know, I have another channel, Lazy Chill Zone, where I have hundreds of hours of content covering all sorts of mysteries. The Iron Maiden is one of the most infamous torture devices linked with the medieval period. It's typically described as a man-sized iron cabinet or coffin lined with sharp spikes on the inside, into which a victim would be placed. Once the doors of the sarcophagus-like device closed, the spikes would pierce the victim's body in multiple places, causing severe pain and a slow death by bleeding. This gruesome image of medieval cruelty has appeared in countless books, museums, and even horror films. However, the historical reality of the Iron Maiden is far more complicated, and many scholars question whether such a device was ever actually used in the Middle Ages at all. Curiously, there are no known medieval records that describe an Iron Maiden device in use. The concept of locking a person in a spiked coffin seems to have pre-medieval origins in legend and literature. Historians have traced early accounts of similar devices in various cultures long before the Middle Ages. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Augustine recount the torture of Roman general Marcus Attilius Regulus. In this story, Regulus was confined in a tight wooden box studded with sharp nails on all sides, so that he couldn't lean without being pierced. He ultimately died from being unable to sleep, rather than from the spikes directly. This tale, though ancient, contains the key elements of an Iron Maiden and may have inspired later imaginations. Another example appears in the Arab world in the 9th century. The Abbasid vizier Ibn al-Zayyat was said to have constructed a wooden chest lined with iron spikes to drop some seriously inhumane abuse on prisoners. Ironically, this cruel invention was reportedly used on Ibn al-Zayyat himself when he fell out of favor in 847, leading to his death inside his own spiked box. This suggests that the story of the spiked chest may have been added to the story later to enhance the moral tale of the story. These early anecdotes suggest that the concept of an Iron Maiden-like torture device has floated around for centuries. None of these, however, were called Iron Maiden, nor is there evidence that a dedicated iron cabinet with interior spikes was actually built in those times. Some historians also point to a medieval German device called the Schandmantel as a possible inspiration. The Schandmantel was essentially a barrel or coat made of wood or metal, used to punish and publicly shame offenders, but it did not contain spikes. 19th century showmen or writers may have misinterpreted or embellished such artifacts by adding spikes in their descriptions or reconstructions. Despite the lack of medieval evidence, the Iron Maiden became firmly embedded in popular imagination as a quintessential medieval torture device. The turning point for this legend seems to have come in the late 18th century. In 1793, a German philosopher and antiquarian named Johann Philipp Siebenkees published an account of an execution supposedly carried out in Nuremberg in 1515. According to his story, a criminal met his fate inside an Iron Maiden, allegedly due to his participation in coin-forging activities. However, modern historians have strong reasons to believe Siebenkees simply fabricated the story as a sensational anecdote. No earlier records corroborate the 1515 execution, and it appears Siebenkees' report was the first time anyone had described such a device being used in medieval Europe. Before I get the comments, I realize 1515 is the early modern period by most modern historiographical standards. That said, the late medieval period is generally agreed to have ended around 1500, so Siebenkees wasn't far off. In the early 1800s, several museums and private collections in Europe started displaying Iron Maiden contraptions, claiming they were relics of medieval torture chambers. The most famous example was the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, which was exhibited as a genuine medieval instrument of pain. Sources indicate that the Nuremberg Iron Maiden was actually constructed around the turn of the 19th century, possibly around 1800 to 1802, specifically for display. It featured a cast iron exterior crafted in a pseudo-Gothic style, often with a female face or religious motifs, and interior spikes that would line up with a victim's vital organs. This artifact gained enormous notoriety and it toured exhibitions and world's fairs, horrifying and fascinating the public with the idea of medieval barbarity. In reality, it was a product of modern craftsmen and imagination, not a surviving medieval object. The original Nuremberg Iron Maiden was destroyed in 1944 when Allied bombing raids struck the city during World War II, but you can see the copy on your screen right now. Today, the consensus in scholarly circles is that the Iron Maiden's medieval existence is a myth. In other words, it was effectively written into history in the 18th and 19th centuries, not the Middle Ages. Some scholars have noted that there was a trend in the 19th century to cobble together various antiques into claimed medieval torture devices. This practice was part of a broader Victorian-era fascination with the dark reality preceding their time, and with the Middle Ages. Oh, and before I end this segment, I have to mention that there's an actual legitimate account of the Iron Maiden being used for its supposed intended purpose. But it's not a medieval usage, and in fact comes from the late 20th and early 21st century. We can all agree that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, right? Well, let's just say that he was an absolute saint compared to his psychopathic son, Uday Hussein, a man who saw the Iron Maiden and thought, yeah, that sounds like good dinner entertainment.